So as part of the Scottish Health Survey, adults were asked about their weight status. And so in Scotland, what was found was that 64% of adults were either overweight or obese in Scotland in 2011. 64%. So quite high figures. However, that was in the bracket of overweight and obese. When we looked at just adults who are obese, 28% of adults in Scotland were obese. So that's quite a large, excuse the pun, proportion. Okay? But those figures are quite shocking. Now, when we look at children, the figures aren't too dissimilar. So in Scotland, 12.1% of 5-year-olds are classed as overweight, with an additional 9.8% being classed as obese. So that's still quite a massive figure being classed as obese, and these are 5-year-old children. Now, this isn't based on BMI, the same as we would with adults, because BMI isn't a very good indicator for children. This is when we look at a whole population of children and we compare your weight next to every other child the same age and the same height. That 9.8% are obese. So it's really quite a stark problem. However, these figures were part of a national measurement programme, and what we found that actually in Wales, they had even more of a problem. So we're not alone in this, but this still is a massive problem. Now, you might be wondering why this actually matters. Maybe this just reflects the fact that our society is changing. We're just getting bigger and we're changing the sort of lifestyle we live. However, there's quite a growing amount of research that shows the detrimental effect that obesity has. So it's linked with musculoskeletal problems, with higher rates of asthma. It's been linked to some cancers as well. There's also links with obesity and anxiety and depression and a whole range of psychological factors, which I'm going to talk about a bit more. Okay. Now, moving from thinking about the negative impact of obesity, if we think about the positive impact of physical activity, there's quite a lot of research showing that the more physical activity we do, it serves as a protective factor. So you've got less chance of having problems in older age. You're less likely to have asthma, you're less likely to pick up certain cancers, you're less likely to develop muscle problems and bone problems. So physical activity seems to have these really strong beneficial effects for your physical health. And in addition to that, there's a really strong amount of research coming out now to show that physical activity has a really positive effect on your psychology. And it's this area of research that I'm going to focus on today, after I've had a second of water. Okay, now, there was a recent review a couple of years ago by a group down in Loughborough, and they looked at all of the physical activity literature in children to try and get a balanced view of what actually the state of the literature was. So what things are affected by physical activity. And they looked at a really big array of research that was going on internationally, so not just work in the UK. And what they found was that when you synthesise this literature, that physical activity was massively beneficial for a wide range of areas for children. So they found that increased activity was linked to a lower risk of depression, lower risks of anxiety, increases in self-esteem, and it also had some increases in cognition. Now, cognition is a term that, as a psychologist, I just banter about and assume that everybody knows what it means. And I need to remember that this isn't always the case. So when we're talking about cognition, I'm talking about your mental ability, so your thinking skills. So your memory, your attention, your ability to plan through a course of action and make decisions. So there's this emerging literature finding that physical activity is beneficial for these sorts of skills. However, this big review concluded that actually there were some unanswered questions and that they couldn't make clear conclusions from the literature because of some of the problems. So often studies were cross-sectional, that is, they'd only look at one point in time, so they couldn't actually tell if there was a cause and effect. They also wouldn't control for things that we commonly know are related to both our academic attainment and cognition and our physical activity. For example, they wouldn't look at social factors, and we know that these have a massive impact on our mental ability. So it seemed that there were these unanswered questions in the literature. Now, briefly following this, there was a second big review paper that focused solely on academic attainment, so on children's grades. And it reviewed all the literature internationally, and it rated it on the quality of the literature, so whether the study was well conducted or not well conducted. And what it concluded was that actually a lot of the studies weren't that rigorous. So they weren't always conducted in the most scientific manner. That is, that they didn't control for these factors, or there were some other problems in terms of how they've measured physical activity or attainment. So they suggested that we needed to do a lot more work in this area. However, they said that when we looked at the high quality studies, that there was a positive impact of physical activity on children's academic attainment. So the more of this moderate to vigorous physical activity that the children were doing, the better they were doing at school. But they cautioned that we needed to find answers and a bit more rigorous nature of our research in order to really have a kind of strong conclusion. So based on this, we set out to try and answer some of these questions and address some of the limitations in the research.